Delta Prime 7 wasn't a place for the weak. Its atmosphere, barely hospitable, tore at exposed flesh with biting winds and razor-sharp grains of sand. The settlements, scattered clusters of domes and prefabricated towers, clung to the planet's surface like barnacles on a rusting hull. Survival here wasn't about thriving. It was about holding on just long enough to see another sunrise through the ever-present haze of dust and radiation. Beneath the heavy dome of Orcs outpost, the holy elders of the Order convened in a great windowless chamber. Their robes shimmered with embedded circuits, their voices carried an almost metallic resonance. They spoke not of compassion or redemption, but of purity, of maintaining the sacred balance that ensured their control over the colony. For decades, their rule had been unchallenged. Then, one night, under the rare convergence of the two eclipsing moons, a child was born, a child unlike any other. The girl's parents, a miner and a repair tech, brought her into the world under hushed whispers and borrowed time. They had no idea what they were holding until the girl's arm glowed faintly under the flickering lights of the outpost's sickbay. At first they thought it was a trick of the failing generators, but the light remained constant, a dim, pulsating sigil that moved beneath the skin. When the attending medbot scanned her, the results were so startling that the tech couldn't suppress a gasp. Traces of biocircuitry intertwined with her human tissues. A fusion of organic and machine, far beyond any known human augmentation. Word spread quickly. And in the Order's doctrine, any life not purely human was considered heretical, a corruption to be purged. Within hours, the elders arrived, their shimmering robes hissing as they moved. They examined the girl in silence, their faces expressionless. The glowing mark was a brand, they declared, proof that this child was a sinner. No trial, no deliberation. The punishment was clear. Exile to the plasma wastes, a death sentence masked as tradition. Her parents pleaded, then fought, and finally wept as the elders dragged the child from their arms. They tried to rally others in the outpost, but no one dared speak against the Order. Fear of contamination ran deep. To harbor the girl was to risk banishment or worse. The plasma waste stretched across Delta Prime 7's equatorial belt, a vast, undulating sea of molten minerals and swirling thermal storms. The girl, barely swaddled, was left at its edge, her tiny form dwarfed by the endless expanse of shimmering, boiling heat. Her cries, thin and reedy, were lost in the crackling roar of the superheated air. The elders left without a word, their silhouettes disappearing back into the dust storm. The outpost went silent, its inhabitants huddling in their domes, pretending they hadn't heard the child's last wail. But someone did hear. Cade Ralek, a disgraced soldier turned smuggler, had been hiding just outside Orcs outpost's perimeter, waiting for nightfall to raid an abandoned supply depot. He had no love for the Order, no allegiance to their so-called purity. For years, he'd been scraping by on the fringes, dodging patrols and running supplies to the unregistered settlers who lived outside the Elders' reach. That night, as he checked his scanner, he caught an unusual energy signature, a faint flickering pulse coming from the edge of the plasma wastes. Curiosity, or maybe instinct, led him to the source. He found her there, the glow of her brand, casting faint shadows on the scorched rocks. For a moment he hesitated. Rescuing her would mean more than breaking the Order's law. It would make him a target. But the way she reached out, tiny fingers grasping at nothing, stirred something Cade hadn't felt in years. Without fully understanding why, he scooped her into his arms, her small body trembling against his chest. The heat was unbearable, the air a toxic soup, but Cade turned back to his rover and disappeared into the storm. By the time the elders realized the child was missing, Cade and his stolen cargo had vanished into the wilderness. All that remained was the faint glow of the brand, slowly fading beneath the swirling sands. Cade's rover was little more than a patched-up hulk, its hull dented by meteorite fragments and its circuits fried more times than he cared to count. Inside, a medkit dangled from frayed straps next to a collection of stolen navigational modules, ancient weapons and a cracked holomap that flickered in and out of focus. The air reeked of ionized grease and stale rations. This was home, and it was nowhere fit for a child. As the storm howled outside, Cade sat on a rusting stool, staring at the girl lying on a makeshift bed of emergency blankets. She hadn't cried again since he'd pulled her from the wastes. Her tiny chest rose and fell steadily, but the glow on her arm remained, a faint pulsing light that Cade couldn't stop glancing at. He'd seen augments before. Back in the Legion, his unit relied on cybernetically enhanced operatives to carry out reconnaissance missions and survive environments like this one. But the girl wasn't augmented. She hadn't been fitted with upgrades in a lab or wired into the Legion's network. Her circuits were part of her, woven into her flesh, growing alongside her. That was something entirely new. The thought chilled him. The Order didn't make mistakes when they declared someone a sinner. They were cruel, dogmatic zealots, but they didn't lash out without a reason. This girl, still too young to speak, was a threat to their control, and that meant keeping her alive would only get harder. He'd have to move fast. Cade scavenged what supplies he had, checking his gear and plotting a course away from Orthus outpost. The girl stirred as he worked, her tiny fingers curling against the blanket. She didn't open her eyes, but a faint sound escaped her lips, a whimper that almost sounded like a name. Saul, Cade muttered to himself. I'll call you Saul. It was more than just a name. It was a reminder, a promise that as long as she was in his care, he'd keep her from burning out like the countless others who'd vanished in the plasma wastes. Saul wasn't just another scavenger's treasure or a stolen trinket to be traded. She was something fragile, something precious. As he prepared the rover's long-range transmitters, Cade debated sending out a signal to some of his old contacts. Perhaps one of the smugglers he used to run with could help. But every time he reached for the comms panel, he stopped. If word got out about Saul, about what she was, there'd be no end to the people coming after her. Not just the Order, but mercenaries, bounty hunters, corporate raiders. No, he couldn't risk it. Not yet. Instead, he set the rover on a course for the southern crags, a labyrinth of jagged rock formations that provided natural cover from the Order's aerial drones. For days, they traveled in silence. Cade spoke to Sewell, though he wasn't sure she understood. He told her about the barren planets he'd fought on, about the comrades he'd lost, about the homes he'd abandoned. Talking to her, even if she couldn't reply, felt like admitting to himself why he'd saved her. She was a reminder of what he'd once believed in, a life worth protecting. Then one evening, while the rover was parked in the shadow of a crumbling mesa, Sewell finally opened her eyes. They weren't like a normal child's eyes. They were brighter. Their irises shot through with faint, shifting lines of light. She looked at Cade, then at her own arm, where the brand still faintly pulsed. Her small hand brushed the mark, and, for the first time, Cade saw confusion on her face. Then fear. It's okay, Cade said, his voice softer than he'd used in years. You're safe here. Sewell didn't respond. She just stared at him as if trying to process his words, her glowing eyes narrowing in concentration. Then, without warning, her lips moved, forming words too faint for him to hear. He leaned closer, and she said it again, barely above a whisper. What am I? What? Cade froze. This wasn't something a toddler was supposed to ask. But Sewell wasn't just a child. She was something more, something both terrifying and miraculous. As the wind howled outside and the rover's lights flickered, Cade realized he didn't have an answer. All he knew was that Sewell wasn't just a random rescue or a forgotten orphan. She was the key to something far bigger, and the world wasn't ready for her. Not yet. What he didn't know was that far above the desert, hidden in the orbital stations that monitored Delta Prime 7, the Elders were already looking for the light that had escaped their grasp. The southern crags were a network of shadows. Twisted rock formations weathered by centuries of acidic storms formed a labyrinth of narrow passageways and towering spires. Cade guided the rover carefully, its wheels crunching over jagged gravel. The land seemed alive in its desolation. Sandfalls cascaded from the cliffs and occasional sparks of electrical discharges danced along the iron-rich stone. For Cade and Sewell, it was the perfect hiding place. No drones could navigate these labyrinthine passages without crashing, and no patrols dared venture into these depths unprepared. But even as the crags offered a temporary reprieve, they also posed new threats: dwindling supplies, hazardous terrain, and the constant gnawing tension of being hunted. Sewell spent most of the journey quiet, seated on the rover's fold-down cot, her glowing eyes, brighter than before, fixed on the shifting landscape outside the thin viewport. Cade noticed how her gaze lingered on certain formations as if she recognized them. It made him uneasy. She was a child, barely able to form sentences, yet her behavior hinted at something deeper, something more than instinct or curiosity. Late, one evening, when the storm clouds had thickened enough to blot out even the faintest star, Sewell finally broke her silence. "I remember," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the rover's engine. Cade glanced over. "What do you remember?" "Circuits," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "Data, running through me." Cade pulled the rover to a stop and turned to face her. "You've never been hooked up to anything. You're a kid. What kind of data are you talking about?" Sewell tilted her head, her glowing eyes meeting his. "It's not just in me. It's everywhere. Under the ground, in the sky, I feel it." She touched the faintly glowing mark on her arm. "It talks to me." Cade leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. He'd always assumed the glow was some sort of advanced augment, maybe an experiment by the Order gone wrong. But if Sewell could feel data, if she was somehow connected to something larger, then she wasn't just a rogue bit of tech. She was a conduit, a living interface to a system he couldn't see. "Does it tell you where we should go?" Cade asked, more to humor her than anything. He didn't expect her to answer, but she did. "It's showing me a place, deep in the crags. I can feel it there." Cade frowned. He trusted his instincts, and they screamed at him to avoid any place that might attract attention. But he couldn't ignore what Sewell was describing. If there really was something hidden deep within the crags, something that called out to her, then maybe it would provide answers. Answers about who she was, about what the Order feared, and maybe even about why Cade couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. The journey took 2 more days. They traversed the sharp, broken trails under cover of darkness, Cade stopping every few hours to recharge the rover's battered cells and scan for pursuers. But no drones came. No patrols closed in. It was as if the crags themselves shielded them, though Cade knew better than to rely on luck. When they finally reached the site Saul had spoken of, Cade saw nothing at first, just another rock face etched with scars of time. But as they drew closer, the glow from Sewell's brand intensified. She stepped out of the rover, her small form framed against the harsh, jagged cliff, and placed her hand on the stone. A low hum filled the air. Slowly, cracks appeared in the rock, light seeping through as if the cliff itself were a massive door. "What the hell is this?" Cade muttered, gripping his sidearm out of reflex. But Sewell didn't seem frightened. She turned to him and said, "It's been waiting." The door slid open, revealing a tunnel that descended deep into the planet's crust. The walls shimmered, faintly, lined with veins of material that looked like a fusion of metal and stone. Cade followed Sewell into the depths, his steps cautious, his weapon at the ready. As they moved deeper, he began to notice strange symbols etched into the walls, glyphs that pulsed with a faint internal light, their patterns familiar, but just out of reach in his memory. At last, they emerged into a vast chamber. Machines stood, silent, their surfaces coated with centuries of dust but still intact. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat a small cylindrical device. Sewell approached it without hesitation. Cade reached out to stop her, but she turned to him, her glowing eyes calm. "It's okay," she said. "I know what to do." Cade let her step forward. She placed her hand on the device, and immediately the chamber came to life. Lights flickered on, casting stark shadows across the walls. The symbols on the walls began to move, shifting and rearranging themselves like living text. Cade felt the hair on his arms stand on end as a hum filled the air, resonating deep in his chest. "What's happening?" Cade demanded, his voice rough. "This is the circuit," Sol replied, her voice steady. "It's what the Order was built on. They don't control it. They never did. But they want to. If they find me, they'll try to use it, to control everyone." Cade stepped closer, his weapon lowered. "What can you do with it?" Sol looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I can change it. I can make it so they can't use it, ever." Before Cade could respond, a distant sound echoed down the tunnel, a high-pitched whine growing louder. He turned sharply, his weapon snapping into position. The Order had found them. Drones and soldiers would be closing in. But in that moment, Cade realized they weren't just after Sol. They were after the circuit, after the power it could give them. Cade gritted his teeth. "Do whatever you have to do," he said to Sol. "I'll hold them off." And as the sounds of pursuit grew closer, Cade prepared for a fight, knowing that the stakes were far greater than either of them had imagined. Cade braced himself at the mouth of the chamber as the sound of whirring engines and clanking boots echoed closer. The Order's patrol drones would be scouting ahead, followed by cyber priests in their shimmering robes, armed with weapons far more advanced than anything Cade carried. He adjusted the charge on his battered rifle and glanced back at Sol, who stood by the glowing pedestal. Her small hands hovered over the cylindrical device, her glowing eyes fixed on its shifting patterns. The light pulsing from her brand intensified, and Cade could feel a faint vibration in the air. "They'll be here any second," Cade said. "Do you have a plan?" "I'm rewriting it," Sol replied, her voice steady yet distant, as though part of her mind was elsewhere. "They want the circuit's control, but I can stop them. I just need more time." "Time's the one thing we don't have," Cade muttered, positioning himself in front of the tunnel's narrow entrance. He could hear the drone engines now, the mechanical buzz accompanied by faint electronic chirps as they scanned the path ahead. Cade raised his rifle, every nerve in his body tense. He had no illusions about surviving this. The Order's forces were too many, too well equipped, but if he could hold them back long enough, if Sol could finish whatever she was doing. The first drone rounded the corner, its sleek body glinting in the chamber's faint light. Cade fired. The shot hit its propulsion unit, sending the drone crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Another appeared, then two more. Cade kept firing, his shots precise but frantic. The drones were faster than he remembered, agile, darting in and out of cover. A plasma bolt whizzed past his ear, striking the wall behind him and sending shards of rock flying. He dropped to one knee, adjusting his aim and taking out another drone. But the sound of marching boots told him the cyber priests weren't far behind. "How much longer?" Cade yelled over his shoulder. "Not long," Sol replied. "The circuit. It's almost done." Cade gritted his teeth. "Whatever you're doing, finish it faster." The first cyber priest appeared, their robed figure stepping into view. Their face was hidden behind a smooth, mirrored visor that reflected the chamber's flickering light. They carried a staff-like weapon, its tip glowing with energy. Cade opened fire, but the priest raised a hand, and the bullets ricocheted off a shimmering energy shield. Cade cursed under his breath, retreating further into the chamber as more priests filed in behind the first. They moved with eerie precision, their every step deliberate. Cade fired again, aiming for their legs, their arms, any exposed part not protected by the energy field. One of them stumbled, their staff falling from their hand. Cade took the opportunity to aim a clean shot, and the priest went down. But there were more. Too many. Sol's voice rang out, suddenly strong and clear. "It's ready." Cade turned to see the cylindrical device glowing with a fierce light, its symbols spinning faster and faster. Sol's brand now burned bright, enough to cast her face in stark relief, her expression calm yet resolute. She touched the device again and a wave of energy rippled outward. Cade felt it wash over him, not a physical force, but something deeper, something that resonated in his bones. The drones froze mid-flight, their lights flickering. The cyber priests staggered, their mirrored visors dimming. Cade watched in awe as their energy shields vanished and their weapons went dark. "What's happening?" Cade asked. I changed the code, Sewell said, stepping away from the pedestal. The circuit can't be controlled anymore. Not by them, not by anyone. It's free now. The chamber fell silent. The drones dropped to the ground, lifeless. The cyber priests, now disarmed, stared at Sewell. Without their shields and weapons, they were just ordinary humans beneath their robes. One by one, they began retreating, their movements stiff and uncertain. Cade didn't stop them. He let them go. His weapon lowered as they filed back out the way they'd come. When the last priest disappeared into the tunnel, Cade turned back to Sewell. The glow from her arm was fading, her eyes dimming to a more natural hue. She looked up at him, exhausted, but calm. Are you okay? He asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded slowly. I'm tired. Cade smiled faintly. You did it. Together they left the chamber behind, climbing out into the crags as the first faint light of dawn broke over the horizon. The storm had passed, the air still and quiet. Cade carried Sewell back to the rover, her small frame light in his arms. She rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing as sleep overtook her. The fight was over. The Order no longer had its power. The circuit was beyond anyone's control, its influence severed, its secrets buried once more. For the first time in years, Cade felt something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Hope. As he placed Sewell gently in the rover's cot and started the engine, he looked out at the barren landscape and thought of the future. It wouldn't be easy. They were still fugitives. They would have to keep moving, keep hiding. But the tide had turned. The Order was weakened, and the people of Delta Prime 7 would soon learn that their gods were not all powerful. Cade glanced back at Sewell, still sleeping peacefully. She was no sinner, no monster. She was a child, a survivor, a new beginning. And as they sped off into the wilderness, leaving the crags behind, Cade knew one thing for certain. He would protect her no matter what.